Hello and welcome back to This is Your Anesthetist. In this episode, we are going to talk about something which is non-anesthesia related and is to do with the recent strikes that have just come to an end. The junior doctors strike, well, that was the old name junior doctors. They're now renamed as resident doctors. So the strikes come to an end a couple of days ago, and I just want to give you a brief insight into what goes on in the planning behind the scenes when such a strike is announced. The government this time has said that most hospitals carried on nearly normal or close to normal activity. And I am not going to comment on that because I haven't myself seen that data, nor is this an opinion piece on whether the strikes are right or wrong. And that's something which you can form your own opinion on. All I intend to do here is just give you a little peek into what goes on behind the scenes. So when the strikes are announced, one of the first things that springs to mind is how are we going to carry on delivering the service that's really essential, and then the stratification of allocating those who are actually working, which is mainly the consultants or the senior doctors and what are known as locally employed doctors. They usually don't strike simply because they do not strictly fall under the radar of what used to be trainees in the specialties. Things might have changed a bit with that, but I find a little bit more on that side. So those doctors tend to work a bit more. This isn't a golden rule that they all do or they all don't. So there's a bit of help from them. So taking into account all of that cohort of doctors, the way things are prioritized is where should they work in order to fulfill the very core activities that the hospitals need to provide, which is the emergency and acute care. So in a normal district general hospital, medium-sized hospitals, for anesthetics per se, there are at least 3, 4, 5 tiers of on-calls, which means that there will be someone, a registrar level person usually present for different areas in the hospital, so such as a labor ward and obstetrics, someone for intensive care, someone for operating theatres, and there may be 1 or 2 people per area depending on how big the hospital is and what the acuity of the cases that present to that hospital is. So let's say you've got 4 tiers of people who need to be on call at a time for anesthetics. And that would mean in a department of, just hypothetically speaking, if we've got a department of, let's say, 30 people or 30 consultants who normally run something like 12 to 15 operating theatres, what you would then do is you'd first send something like a tender out to say, well, who's available to work, who's willing to work the long days, the night shifts, and stay resident in hospitals at night to do the work, the out-of-hours work. And typically you would get a response from a few people who would be happy to work, and they get paid extra for this work. So you'd staff those areas initially. So in the department of 30 people, you take out 4 people, staff those areas, let's say 4 people for the long day, 4 people for the night. Now the people on the night, bear in mind that they can't work on the day that they're doing the night, and obviously they can't work the next day because they're going to have some mandatory time off. Clearly they will be tired and fatigued from having worked the night shift. It's the same with resident doctors, and the same rules apply to anyone else who does those night shifts. So automatically you've taken, let's say, again, in this hypothetical example of a department of 30 people, you've taken 8 people out. And the same process goes on for the rest of the duration of the strikes, which typically so far has been 4 to 5 days. That leaves you with a handful of people, let's say 10 to 15 people who are available to staff the operating theatres in the daytime. Now, of all the operating theatres, there are some which trump the others. Things like the emergency theatre, things like trauma theatre, where if you've got broken bones, injuries, that sort of thing, will obviously need to be prioritized. So emergencies, trauma theatre, and then in the daytime, usually a labor ward person and someone to run elective cesarean sections. So these 4 or 5 different areas, and again, depending on the hospital, there might be other similarly important areas which could run. For example, you could have someone running intervention radiology. Let's say it's a big hospital and they have a big intervention radiology service or someone available all the time to go to the cath lab, where if you have a heart attack and you came into hospital, to have what's called a primary PCI to open up your coronary arteries. They might need help from an anesthetist to stabilize the patient, sometimes to even deliver sedation or a general anesthetic if they are very, very sick. So all of these areas get staffed. That leaves you with a small percentage of people, so maybe 4, 5, 6 people. Again, I'm talking about this hypothetical example of a department with 30 consultants. The 4, 5, 6 people, whatever you have left, are the number of theaters that you can run. Now, how do we decide in between all the different specialties? So the specialties, again, district general hospital, you could have things from plastic surgery, general surgery, orthopedics to gynecology, many different specialties, and how are they prioritized? Well, there's this thing called a clinical stratification meeting. Might be known by other names in other hospitals, but that stratification meeting, representatives from all these specialties turn up to this meeting and talk about how urgent the cases that they've got pending are. So typically things like cancers, people who've been waiting an extremely long time to have their operations done and were originally meant to have them on these days and should not be moved. Small children sometimes get prioritized. And based on that, it's almost like a bit of a pitching game. Some get approved, some don't get approved. The ones that don't get approved obviously move on to be listed somewhere else further down the line where they can be feasibly done. So a lot of time goes into planning for these operations, for these operating lists, and what to staff them. A huge amount of time, as you can see, for all the specialty representatives they're usually medium to middle to senior level managers from these specialties who would bring those cases to the table. And after a lot of to and fro discussions, analyzing what's more urgent than the others, these get listed. Those go ahead, and then once the strikes are over, there's a bit more work to do with all of these specialties, sitting down with more senior managers from finance this time to look at who's worked what shift. Bear in mind that all of these shifts, the night shifts, the long days, all of the out of hours shifts are done on an extra payment basis by the consultants because they're not normally programmed to deliver that service out of hours. So the specialties have to sit down with the finance managers, analyze each and every shift that's been done so that the payment that goes out to them is reflected accurately. These managers then have to go back to their specialties to see what was left over from the clinical stratification process and see when they can be dated and listed. So it is a huge amount of work that goes in before the strikes, obviously during the strikes and after the strikes or industrial action. It is a long drawn out process, which in this time hardly anything else gets done. So quite a large amount of work that goes on behind the scenes. So that was just for your information, and hope to see you next time.